How you doing? My name is David Brown with Family Initiative. I'm here today with...
My name is Stephanie Boyer. I'm also with Family Initiative.
So super excited today to talk a little bit about sensory processing disorder. Certainly one of those issues that we've noticed recently in the field has gained more and more traction, more attention from a lot of caregivers. So we're super excited today to talk to Stephanie a little bit about sensory processing disorder. So Stephanie, could you really quickly, just brief overview, kind of touch on like what is sensory for kids?
For sure. So sensory is how we bring in and interpret stimuli in the environment. This helps us interact appropriately with our environment. It helps us regulate. It helps us determine safety. And then when there's a dysfunction in that, a lot of children present unsafe behaviors and also have a difficulty with regulation and also interacting with their environment.
All right, awesome. So one of the things I know that we see a lot is working with caregivers, and they express a lot of frustration, I think, in determination around managing behaviors with kids. And I know recently in talking to a lot of caregivers, I think what they're struggling with and recognizing, which I think is dynamite, is trying to figure out when the children are exhibiting behaviors, is that truly behavior-based, or is that a catalyst because of sensory challenges that they're having? So what might be some things that caregivers could do to sort of determine, is it grounded more in sensory, or is this kind of really straightaway behavior?
Well, first you have to determine like where the sensory is coming from, where the dysfunction is coming from. So that's kind of like a loaded question because sensory is so complex. And it could be like a multi-level answer to that question. So you have your 8 types of sensory. You have your visual, your auditory, your sight, your smell, your taste. But then you also have your proprioception, your vestibular, and your interoception. So your proprioception is your body awareness, where you are in the environment, understanding how your body, the strength that's needed, the force that's needed to do certain things. Your vestibular is your understanding of movement and balance, and your interoception is how your body works together, your understanding of what's going on the inside. So understanding those 8 things will help you kind of determine whether or not it's a behavior. You also have to understand that there's different levels, so you can be under-responsive to one of these sensory systems, or you can be over-responsive to one of these sensory systems, or you can be seeking out this different sensory. So your over-responsive children are going to be your children that over-respond to this sensory. So they're going to be more fearful. They're going to be more aversive or avoiding this sensory. Your under-responsive are going to be seeking it out, or these children are also very much in their own shell. They're hard to get out. And your sensory seekers, they're going to be seeking this out. So going back to your question, whether or not it's behavior or if it's sensory, you have to determine, are they seeking it out? Are they avoiding it? You know, what's going on?
Okay, cool. So I'm just thinking, if I'm a dad, I'm at home every day, spend time with my kids. What things like behaviorally specific would that look like, right? So if it's going to be sensory in one of those areas, and maybe give like an example or 2 of each of those things. If I'm just observing their behavior every day at home, or like the teachers are talking to me at school, how would I be able to figure that out? Like, what things should I be looking for in certain kinds of environments?
Okay, so say we're talking about a child who has an auditory sensitivity, right? A child that is over-responsive to auditory stimuli is going to be the ones that avoid the auditory stimuli. They're going to be the ones that are like fearful of this auditory stimuli, or they might exhibit running or elopement whenever there's a loud sound or unpredictable sound. Your children that are under-responsive are going to have a harder time responding to auditory stimuli. So they're going to have a harder time responding to directives or names or any kind of compliance. If we're focusing on auditory as of now, if you have a child who is over-responsive, you're going to have a child that is going to be fearful. They're going to be avoiding loud sounds. If you have a child that's under-responsive, you're going to have a child that is more in their shell, not responding to sounds or not responding to communication.
And it's cool because I think as a caregiver, as a dad, it's funny because I think it's a new way to sort of look at our kids. Because I think sometimes to be cognizant and thinking about it's their surroundings. Because I think sometimes as a caregiver, you focus on their behavior, right? And somehow it's between us, like if I'm raising, right, my children. So I think it's a fascinating way to rethink the behavior that we're dealing with, that it could literally be the surroundings. So also to be conscientious, right, about not just what they're doing and how I'm managing that, but also is there something else that's really the catalyst of what's kind of creating the behavior?
For sure. And we also see too that a lot of times that it might be sensory based, but manifests into a behavior. So going back to this auditory, if you have a child who has an auditory sensitivity, they are over responsive to auditory stimuli. That means they're more fearful. If there is a loud sound, they might run. That running then becomes a behavior. So anytime that they hear a sound, elopement happens. And this could be a fire drill, they might running away. This could be a toilet flushing, they might run away. Or this could simply be the AC clicking on and they might run away. So we don't know, you have to figure out like where that stimuli is coming from to really determine whether or not like the behavior is sensory or not.
Okay. So I don't know if I'm jumping ahead, but like as a caregiver, I'm going here, right? So if I'm knowing that or suspecting that is what's going on, some strategies, resources, tools, things I can do to kind of help work with the kids in my care.
Right, so we can go through the different sensory systems and I can give you some strategies based on, whether they're over-responsive or unresponsive. So let's go back to the auditory because we've been talking about that a few times. So if a child is over-responsive, you can do headphones, you can have a soundproof house. If they're under-responsive, you can use communication devices, you can use text or pictures, trying to facilitate that conversation. Sensory seeking, they're seeking out that auditory. You can use a lot of toys with a lot of sounds, you can play background music. If we're talking about a child who is visually, they're seeking out, they're over-responsive to visual. They have a tendency to avoid eye contact. They have a tendency to show aversive reactions to bright lights. So for that, you can reduce lighting. You can have more natural lighting. You can teach them strategies of when they're learning social skills to look at the lips or look at the hairline. So when they're under-responsive to visual, they have a hard time with handwriting. They have a hard time with clutter. Competing background or puzzles. So the best thing you can do at your home if they're under responsive is to reduce clutter.
So the other thing I'm thinking is, so there's some strategies in the home. Obviously there's like lots of other environments our kids go into too, like with school and childcare and lots of other things. Any strategy suggestions about like the other folks in their lives? What can we do to sort of like get them on board and I don't know, like try to help support our kids in totality? Because I know our guys go lots of other places besides just our houses.
Right, so if we're talking about like auditory, again, going back to auditory because it's just a hot topic, you can explain to the people that are around them that, they're not just avoiding you, that they need a little more push to, if they're under responsive, they need a little more push to come out of their shell and to understand what you're saying. So using a lot of visuals, using initially a lot of exaggerated communication, like saying hi and bye, so that they become more out of their shell and they do register better. If we're talking about schools, just explaining the different triggers of what may cause these aversive reactions. If you know that your child is over-responsive to auditory, providing headphones or, letting the teachers know that loud sounds may cause an effect of running, that kind of stuff.
And it's interesting too because I've noticed that a lot recently. I see more and more kids now with headphones on, right? And going to like school settings or out in the community. So I think it's really cool to see that more and more caregivers are sort of like picking up on that, right? And there's, I think, more resources now, right, to support kids in that way. So the only other part I can really think of is for caregivers, is there anything you feel like we haven't touched on thus far that is important for them to know or just kind of think about if they're suspecting that potentially there's some kind of a sensory challenge or issue that might be exacerbating behaviors that we didn't cover?
Well, growing up, we've always learned about the 5 sensory systems, but I think it's really important to also talk about proprioception and vestibular because those are things that people don't talk about commonly. They're not common knowledge. They're not common language. So your vestibular is your balance and movement. So a child that has dysfunction in vestibular is going to either seek out vestibular movement, they're going to be constantly running, or they're going to be avoiding movement. So they're going to be more fearful of your movement. So if you have a child that is climbing or running or jumping that is under-responsive to vestibular, the behaviors might be showing that they are, hyperactive, but really it could be a sensory thing. And it's the same thing with proprioception, which is body awareness. Your proprioception input is knowing where your body is in space. So if a child is under-responsive to proprioceptive, they're going to be seeking that out. They're going to be the ones that are pushing and pulling. They're going to be trying to get that input into their joints. So that might look like inappropriate behavior, and it is socially inappropriate, but it could be based in sensory. So if you have a child who is aversive to smell and taste, that's typically shown when they're eating. They may show aversive to certain foods. They may gag when certain foods are presented. So a child that is over-responsive is going to show those aversion or try to avoid certain tastes, flavors, or smells. A child who is under-responsive needs a lot more, so they seek out a lot of bold flavors. Something that you can do at home for your children that are over-responsive or fearful of different flavors is try to incentivize it. Reward trying new flavors or new foods with a preferred food. For a child who is under-responsive, you can cook with bold flavors. For a child who shows tactile dysfunction or sensitivity with tactile, a child who is over-responsive is going to avoid being touched. They're going to avoid certain clothing, certain textures. It's going to be hard for them to go into the sand maybe or play in dirt. For a child that is under-responsive to tactile, they are going to want to seek out different textures all the time. They're going to want to seek out that touch. They're going to want to messy play. They're going to want to be involved in shaving cream and sand. So for your children that are aversive to tactile, ones that are fearful of tactile, you can do very comfortable clothing, tagless clothing. You can have them involved in messy play, but maybe using a paintbrush instead of using fingers to paint, or using a rolling pin instead of putting their hands in Play-Doh. For your children that are under-responsive and they're seeking this out, allow that messy play. Get the shaving cream out and make a mess. It's easy to clean up. Or you could also have them just explore different textures or allow different textures into their life, into their foods, into their play. For your children that are proprioceptive and they have a dysfunction in proprioceptive, these are going to be your children, if they're under-responsive, they're going to be seeking that out. They're going to be your kids that are bear hugging you. Those are going to be your kids that push and pull you everywhere. And so for those children, allow structured time on a trampoline maybe, or on a crash pad. They also make weighted blankets. They also make weighted pillows. Those are really good for those kids that need that deep input, those compressions. For your children that are over-responsive, these are your kids that are going to avoid any kind of movement, fearful of movement for your proprioception. So for these kids, engaging them into their environment with preferred, but also very gentle, showing them it's a safe place. Your children that have vestibular dysfunction, these are your children that may be fearful of movement or seeking out movement. Because remember, vestibular is associated with balance and movement. So for your children that are over-responsive or fearful of movement, again, just gentle engagement, reinforcement for movement in different environments on the playground or swings, just showing them that it's safe and it's okay. For your children that are under-responsive and they're seeking that out, allow them to swing, allow them to have fun on the playground, maybe installing a hammock or swing in your home and that kind of stuff, allowing movement.
Gosh, it's fascinating because the way you describe those kids, that sort of sounds classically like something different, right? You wouldn't think necessarily when you observed a child engage in that behavior that it was a sensory type issue, right? You're thinking lots of other things that I think lots of folks are familiar with. So I think that's pretty intriguing.
So if you do have any sensory concerns about your child, if this does spark any ideas that you may have or concerns, it's important to talk to your pediatrician, your primary physician, maybe get an evaluation for an occupational therapist or talk to your neurologist. And if you have any further questions for me, my name is Stephanie Boyer and you can contact me at sboyer@fi-florida.org.